All right, so this is our last kind of lecture series on the end of Souls in Transition. And this will be the last week of lectures. So I'm going to do a three-part lecture for this one on chapters 8, 9, and 10. And the 9 and 10 are going to be much shorter. The chapter 8 lecture is going to be much longer because it is such a big, important, meaty chapter. All right, so first of all, I said you didn't have to read chapter 7. I took that out, so I wanted to just quickly say, what did you miss there? So what this chapter was a follow-up of some of the teens that they highlighted in the first book called Soul Searching, not Souls Searching, about their Wave 1 data and the teenage years. And so what they say in chapter 7 is that most of these teens demonstrate continuity when it comes to their religious and spiritual life as emerging adults. And this theme of continuity is something that we're seeing in each of these chapters here. They say normally the best predictor of where people are going is where they have come from. And I just wanted to pop over to that page there, page 109. Like I said, you didn't have to read this, but I'm just going to read part of it to you. And so starting a little bit further down the paragraph, there's many potential alternative life strategies and solutions to people's difficulties. Some people deal with problems by joining the military, some get divorced, others end up in prison, some persist in drinking heavily and taking drugs. Others simply change friends and moderate their behavior. There are clearly many complicated possible paths across life. At a general level, however, the important analytical sociological questions concern the structures, keep that in mind, that maintain religious stability in some people's lives, and the combinations of difficulties and resolutions that generate religious or other changes in people's lives. About those, sociologists have much to learn. But one thing is certain sociologically. Operating at the heart of both personal and religious stability and change are the crucial matter of significant personal relationships, both those that affirm and bind, and those that break down and set loose. Rarely do people's thinking and feeling and behaving change drastically or stay the same without significant social relationships exerting pressures to do so and facilitating these outcomes. Significant personal relationships may not be the heart of religious life itself, but they certainly provide the bones and other muscles with which the heart of religion beats. I just really like some of the wording there. So I think that's important in thinking about, we're thinking here about structure, thinking about structure and culture, thinking about structure and also choice. And as we think about back to Unit 1, thinking about group life, what this is talking to is about the importance of significant relationships, and those relationships are happening within groups and different groups, and whether they're influential in different ways, those relationships are really, really important. And so what they say here again is that continuity in life is the default. And then it's when people, the difficulties people encounter, coupled with plausible alternatives for how they're going to solve these problems, plausible alternative life choices, that significant changes happen in people's lives. And so that, these trajectories, they're of course not set in stone. There is opportunity for change, but we're more likely to see continuity than change. And it's these moments that happen, these combinations of factors that is when people are making these changes. So we're going to move on now to part 1. Like I said, this is a longer lecture. I'm talking about chapter 8, with our learning outcome goal being that students will be able to define the social causal mechanisms and use them to explain the causal factors identified in chapter 8. So in terms of this chapter is about religious trajectories. Goodness, it's based on the quantitative longitudinal data. This is the toughest chapter to get through statistically. It is heavy. It is, even though they're not including like all their calculations and stuff in here, it is a really data heavy chapter. So I'm going to pull out a lot of things that I want you to get out of this chapter. First off, they have 4 goals of this chapter. And I really see this as like the culmination of everything that they've talked about so far. And even though there's 2 more chapters that follow, looking at outcomes and conclusions, I really see this as like the big data chapter here. So first of all, they want to know what makes emerging adults religious. I've used the term EA throughout the PowerPoint as an abbreviation for emerging adults. So they want to identify factors related to the teen years that correlate statistically with religious differences during the emerging adult years, and that act as causal influences on those differences. So what causes what to happen? Not just that they're related, but like what caused what. And then beyond the what caused what, they want to know why that caused that to happen. So why and how do these things make emerging adults religious? This is what they call those causal social mechanisms. So they want to theorize the causal social mechanisms here that explain the association between the identified teenage factors and the emerging adult religion outcomes. Third, they want to know what are the pathways to emerging adult religiosity. They're going to examine combinations of factors that represent different paths to the same highly religious emerging adult outcomes. And it's the longitudinal data that gives them the statistical power to be able to do this, and which is just really cool in my nerdy sociologist world. And then here's a few things that they talk about at the end of the chapter that I'm just going to talk about right here. A few other things they take a moment to look at is, first of all, they examine first-time commitments to God. And it appears that these commitments are really set in early life, mostly before the age of 14. I think they said about 70% of those commitments are set early. And that it has a lot of continuity. They look at whether higher education corrodes religion, because that's a typical thought. They said with their data, it doesn't corrode religion, and even some evidence suggests the opposite. And then finally, the possibility that many emerging adults are privately but not publicly religious, this whole spiritual but not religious thing. And they said there's not much data here, that the teens or the emerging adults appear to be either all or nothing. All right, here we go with the data. So this table is from page 213. I'm going to turn there in my book as well. And I kind of think of this as kind of a religious mobility table. If you've seen a social mobility table, it looks at how people change social class over time. And this is looking at using that longitudinal data from wave 1 and wave 3, looking at how folks are changing not religious groups, not religious traditions here, but like their level of religiosity, which I'm going to talk about in the next slide. So we've got wave 1 and wave 3 data. So they grouped the respondents by 4 levels of religiousness here: lowest, minimal, moderate, and highest. The first 2 rows on the chart, and I had to draw on my table because just to see them better. So they show what percent were in each of these levels of religiousness in the aggregate at each wave. So at wave 3 at the top, we can see there was about, the biggest group there was the minimal with 32%, but then all the other groups had about 22 to 23% in those groups. Underneath that, we see the wave 1 data. So we can see that these numbers have changed, right? That 11 is smaller than 22, and so that means that overall there were more emerging adults at wave 3 that were lower religion than at wave 1. And then the bottom 4 rows of the table show the different movement. So we see here the third row, the percent of wave 1 that moved to a more religious group in wave 3, then next the percent of wave 1 that moved to a less religious group, then the percent of wave one that stayed the same, and then at the bottom there, the percent of wave 1 moving 2 or more categories. So in either direction, moving 2 or more up or 2 or more down, which means a more significant change. All right, so I wanted to mention here how they measured the religiosity for that chart on the previous previous slide. So they created a measure of religiosity with these 3 things: frequency of religious service attendance, professed importance of faith in everyday life, and frequency of personal prayer. There's a very long note in the appendix on page 334 for a very detailed description of how they did this and these survey questions. But they talk about that they had to figure out how to measure religiosity to look at these groups and how they moved, and that these three variables, these three measures, were pretty statistically powerful. And I think that we can relate these back to both Unit 1 and Unit 2 in thinking about levels of religiosity and what these types of things represent. We've got that public devotion in terms of service attendance, and we've got personal devotion in terms of prayer, and then that professed importance of faith, that self-identified, this thing is important to me, which is more, it seems to make more sense than saying like what religious tradition you're a part of. So they produce these 4 levels of religiousness based on calculations from these variables here. And like I said on the previous chart, when we look at those first 2 rows, it shows a general decline in the aggregate as a group in religiosity between the teen and emerging adult years. So if we look at, look along on your book with me here, we see that there are definitely lower numbers at the highest levels of religiosity in wave 3 than there were in wave 1. But by grouping the teens in terms of their levels of religiosity, and then looking at who moved where, it gives us a better picture of what's actually happening, rather than, and it is true, there's a general decline in religiosity, but it's more complicated than that, right? So a couple of things to point out here. The highest religious category had the most extreme change. So 1 in 4 moved to the minimal or lowest. So that's looking at that bottom line in the chart there, that's saying that the percent from that group that changed to or more. So going from highest to either minimal or lowest. That's a pretty big change. And then they say another point there too is that those who were the moderately religious teens were the most likely to shift overall, to have any type of shift. That more than half of the moderately religious became less religious, and then 1 in 5 became more religious. So they had movement in both directions. So taking it apart from the aggregate here, looking at to which group they moved to, gives us a more complex picture of religiosity. All right, so they identified 5 factors that most strongly associated with robust religious life in emerging adulthood. So these are these 5 factors were frequency of personal prayer, and they call this a personal practice. Having seriously committed parents. So this relates to strong relational modeling, that the parents were both modeling being religious, but they were also a part of the young adults support system. And then later, what's not mentioned here is having other adults in a congregation to be supportive. Engaging religious faith in a way that makes it very important in one's daily life. So a genuine internalization of what faith means to you. Number 4, having few religious doubts, another part of internalization. And then lastly, having many personal religious experiences, which is also a part of internalization. So one thing we might note about these factors too is that these are things that were measured in wave 1 and were still associated, still importantly associated with religion at wave 3. So they were, these are like robust statistical measures here. And we need to, note too that there are always outliers when it comes to looking at things in the aggregate. And so, maybe you're thinking about yourself or someone of like, well, I know someone who, and of course we all do. That's how statistics work. We see the normal curve, and we know that there are outliers in both directions here. But these statistics help us look at the big picture and look at kind of what's going on in the aggregate. All right. So one thing they talk about too, and again with the power of the longitudinal data, is that not only can they look at these correlates from which variables are correlated with religion, but they can start to map things out and see some pathways here. And so they've got some the charts here that are on. One chart is the first one that we're going to look at is pathways to high religiosity, and this is on page 226. And so they say that how do highly religious emerging adults become highly religious? How do they get to be that way? And so 68% of teens, which is a clear majority, who followed one of the 6 pathways outlined on page 226, became highly religious. And they go through each one of these pathways. They really detail each one of them. And so I'm not going to talk about each of the factors here, but most of these pathways involve strong relational ties to religion, involving something usually about parents or other religious adults, and a faith that is personally embraced very strongly, so that, really strong personal commitment, and then typically regular personal devotional religious practices. So those things like frequency of attendance or prayer. And so there was no single factor that produced high religiosity. There wasn't just this one thing, this one like magical thing, but it was really a combination of things. And they detail too, like which percent followed each pathway. But those are for the majority of teens, who followed one of these pathways, they did become highly religious. But then what happens with the low religiosity? How do you get to low religiosity? What caused highly, and especially those who started high and then went low? Because this goes against that idea of continuity. And so they found 3 main pathways here from high to low religiosity. So those folks who experienced lower parental religiousness, lower personal importance of religion, and combinations of doubts about faith, less frequent personal devotions, and fewer religious experiences. And so they've got that chart on page figure 230. So they said that 60% of teens, again a majority, who experienced one of these pathways ended up as emerging adults in the low religion category. So it's not surprising then that these factors that they're identifying here are kind of the opposite of the high religiosity, having highly religious parents versus low religious parents. You have different outcomes, especially when it's different combinations of these things. All right. So now we get to the really important part, the social causal mechanisms. This is the how and the why. And I like how he says, I don't know if you can hear the leaf blowing that's going on outside my house right now. But he says something about how sociology, if it's worth anything, we have to be able to identify the how and the why. Like, this is the really important stuff here. And so he says, or they say, if the factors not only correlate but also cause those outcomes, why and how do they cause them? So I think if you start out by looking at the table summary on page 241 here, it looks like this, that this is a way to see how these are organized. And I don't have them written down here. It might be easiest for you to write them out in your notes in a way that makes most sense to you. If we were in class, I would have you play kind of like a matching game with them. But what they're looking at is they've got in this table, if you kind of follow along with me here, in the first column, they have the theoretical mechanism. So this is the social causal mechanism. This is the how and the why. And then they've got a description in the middle there. So this is like the definition of each of the social causal mechanisms. And then on the last column there, the significant variables supporting operation. And so the way that makes more sense to me to organize them, if I were doing this in my notes, I would start with those significant variables and kind of look at, because those are the things that make up each one of the boxes in the pathways. And so these are the factors that are correlated with, high or low religiosity. So to me, it makes more sense to look at each of those factors in the pathway, and then how they describe in the pages before this table why those things matter. But I think looking at the table and kind of being able to map those out a little bit, that's how I would do it in my notes to help me understand. So, like, for example, here, they talk about, for both the ideas of having strong parental religion and supportive religious adults, one of the reasons why that matters, how and why that matters in terms of emerging adults becoming religious, is because of religious socialization. That both of those factors of adults, supportive adults and parents in a person's life, that happens because those adults are socializing the kids. And so this is really, I think this is one of the most important things in the book, because first of all, the data collection, the study design, that's what I'm getting at. The study design allows us to determine these social causal mechanisms. And this is really statistically powerful. And a lot of things, if it's not longitudinal data, especially without multiple data points, then you can't figure that out. And this is really, I think, where the sociologists, some of the meatiest things, why do things happen? We can figure that out with this type of data. So I would spend some time here kind of making sure that you understand these, just because it is such a big, powerful, meaningful part of the book and the study. All right, and then the last thing they talk about here is in terms of trajectories. So the camera's covering up a little bit of the PowerPoint, but it says, what groups of teens reflect religious stability or change at various levels over time as they become emerging adults? So something else they can do with the longitudinal data is that they can kind of look at, what direction are people going in here. And here's just a few points from this part of the chapter here. They talk about, it matters where teens start. And so those who end up highly religious are also likely to start highly religious. Again, the idea of continuity, that people are really likely to end up where they start, because of all the social causal mechanisms as well that they just talked about. And so that starting point matters. Next point here, when noticeable change happens, it's typically religious decline. Only a small proportion increases in religiousness. That overall, the change is about decline. I like how they talk about, too, and they mention this in a few different places with similar wording, the idea that outcomes are not a confused random jumble. It's not the outcomes, you just throw them in the air and the pieces fall where they may. They're pretty predictable. They represent a lot of continuity in terms of their outcomes. And two, I would say, before I get to this next point, it's pretty easy when you start linking all these their pieces of data together, that you can their outcomes are predictable, that they're not, because they aren't a random jumble, they're not chaotic, they are following different trajectories. And then I think really interestingly, what I didn't type out here, I started to on the PowerPoint, but I thought, I'll just point you to the right direction here, is that each of these 6 groups, so in terms of the trajectories, they separate them into 6 groups. They comprise different religious groups, racial groups, and genders. So, for example, what they call the high stable group, it's disproportionately made up of conservative Protestants, Black Protestants, African Americans, and females. And then they go through each one of the groups there and look at, the majority, or what's the disproportionate amount there, who's making up that trajectory. And so that's interesting to see, how different trajectories of religiosity, who's following those trajectories. So I know this was a really long lecture. Thanks for sticking with me. And the next two parts are going to be much shorter.